I'm attending a side seminar here at Stanford. It's the Stanford Institute for Theoretical Economics. They have workshops, and my workshop is about latest developments in asset pricing. That's the workshop I attend. And there was a lecture which I thought is worth mentioning. It was about, can the Fed influence inflation? And the whole lecture was pretty interesting, typical economics type, financial economics type model, where they build a model and then they talk about the variables and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, like many times in financial economics, the solution is almost in a sense that you can say, well, the Fed can influence inflation as long as there's no unexpected shocks. Whenever there's an unexpected shock, then they can influence inflation for a while, and then things get back to equilibrium. But I want to talk about this, but the main thing I want to talk about is actually interesting. I spoke with Ken Judd, who is one of the Hoover Institute members and organizers of this seminar, and he told me something to my question. And my question that I asked in the panel was, what about debt to GDP? Is that a variable we should think about? And isn't there, with an increase of debt to GDP, basically the ability to control the ability to control inflation basically goes to zero, because that's what happens in emerging markets typically. So where do we stand here? And two interesting points. One is the answer by the economists was kind of like, good question, never thought about this one, which is of course shocking if you think about it. This is the 800-pound gorilla in the room and nobody's talking about it. But second, Judd said something interesting. He said last time the US was going towards 130, 140, 150% type GDP to debt to GDP relationships, that was in World War II. And had we not dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we would have had even higher debts. And, it kind of made me think. I mean, this is one of those pivotal moments where you talk to somebody and they say something you would never have expected. And then you go do some research and find out why they do this. And I think my conclusion here is that people see the world the way they think, and people think the way they see the world. Theory and observation are very closely knit together, and observation is theory a lot, and something that David Deutsch talks a lot about, and Popper. And I think in this case, it's a beautiful example of somebody who works at the Hoover Institution, whose job is to think about war and peace and the power of the US within that context. That's kind of what the Hoover Institution does. And then, of course, he thinks of debt and GDP and influence of the Fed through the lens of, well, we just dropped the bomb and finished the war, and that's how we manage our debt. So this is just, it's an anecdote. I don't want to read too much into it, but I think, like many things in this podcast series, it's little nuggets that maybe right now might not seem so interesting, but they are interesting to me, and I feel like they're worth mentioning. This is not even on podcast. It's September 6, 2023. This is Krim Delko. This is the second episode today. There's no more updates. So for the year, we are up 118.2%. The market's up 16. We're up from about 102.2%. So the side seminar here at Stanford is something we do now traditionally almost every year. When I say traditionally, I mean this is the second year we do it, but I think it's going to become a tradition in September. There's a bunch of workshops that Stanford is organizing on many different topics in economics. It's pretty interesting, I think. Lots of economists from around the world fly in, talk about their papers. I think it's one of those seminars that is definitely worth attending, even if you're not a professional economist, if you don't have skin in the game as a professional. But if you are an economist, and if you're in the sort of asset pricing business, which is what we are here at Orange Capital Partners, then I think it's worth thinking about these things. Just thinking about it. Maybe there isn't too much, tangible conclusion right away. Okay, well, I'm just going to make a trade right now based on information. It's not that kind of thing. It's a lot more about, long-term thinking. And I think what Ken Judd told me is really interesting. He said the U.S. was going towards a higher debt to GDP, and they dropped the bomb. And you often think about these things. Why did they develop the bomb? And they did develop it, of course, to fight the Nazis. But then when it turned out that the Nazis don't have the bomb, they still used it And probably the reason they used it is to save lives, but also to save money. And this is something I never thought about. And it's just interesting that when you go to institutions like the Hoover Institution, which again, whose mission is to really think about war and peace and the role of the United States within the context of those two variables, you understand why Ken is coming from this perspective. And we spoke a little bit more about other things, the US debt to GDP, and he thinks it's not such a big deal. But he was a bit reluctant to make the argument. And I was, quite frankly, a little bit annoyed that he was the only one who actually even reacted to my questions. The other one just ran away. The other economists avoided me because it seems like that's a taboo. It's a taboo that we don't talk about these things. And another, in my opinion, almost shocking observation is when I ask economists about, for example, the way they measure inflation expectation is they take the break-even inflation, which is the spread between nominal and real interest rates priced from tips and treasuries. And lo and behold, you say, well, don't you realize that this market is completely torn apart because the Fed is a big player in the market? And the answer is, well, not really. That's a dummy variable. We don't accept. We don't think about too much. And then I said, well, I mean, how has it been in the past? And then nobody really knew. And then I said, actually, while I was talking about, well, actually, before Ben Bernanke, there was no debt involvement by the Fed, or no involvement by the Fed in the U.S. debt market. And almost nobody knew that or pretended not to know it. I don't know which one it is, but it's just another sign that the really relevant questions here, which is debt to GDP, the ability to manage the economy once you have a certain amount of debt, or the inability once the debt approaches certain levels and goes above them. How do you deal with that, and how do you manage that kind of situation? I mean, those are questions that are, in my opinion, worth asking, and questions that, quite frankly, get neglected. I mean, that's my interpretation, is that those questions get neglected. Now I could be wrong. I could be unfair. I could be, doing injustice to these people. I think most of these people have a genuine professional interest in doing the best job they can, but they're also exposed to professional pressures, peer pressure, and the typical vanity, complacency, and all that stuff that prohibit them from really thinking through a problem from first principles, and maybe questioning some fundamental, deep questions, such as, for example, well, how about we consider the current level of debt to GDP in the United States as too high, that we actually can't run the economy anymore effectively. That is not being discussed. This is a concern. I would say the largest concern on Wall Street today has to be the large debt to GDP, because it's not just large, it's also going to increase. By the way, Ken told me part of the problem is not the debt really, it's the interest. And he also mentioned that the US should have issued much more long-term debt to circumvent this problem, which I thought, is probably true, but it's kind of not really mentioning the problem for what it actually is, which is we have too much debt. So it's, again, it seems to me that the economics profession, particularly financial economics profession, is trying to avoid this problem. And I'm a bit, maybe I'm too influenced by Austrians and the Bitcoin community, but it seems to me that, yeah, I mean, there's certainly a grain of truth here if we just make the argument that all these professional economists are just sort of, either directly or indirectly employed by the Fed, and they just keep, bouncing the narrative. And even though the Fed is actually more of a hostage in this whole debt conversation, nevertheless, it's still, in sort of the party line is to protect the Fed and protect the current status quo of theory and the current status quo of actionable vectors and all of that stuff, instead of really asking the question, well, aren't we kind of almost over the hump here into territory where we can't control the economy? So to summarize my first impressions of the side seminar this year that I'm attending at Stanford, it's about new approaches in asset pricing. And I'm a bit disappointed at the anecdotal evidence that it looks to me that financial economists are neglecting the big gorilla in the room, which is the high debt to GDP ratio that we have currently in the country, which is going to influence the ability of the Federal Reserve to control the economy, which is the main topic of research of financial economists. I think financial economists are, in my opinion, way too endogenous. So they look at data within the market. So they're kind of like algo traders. They just look at the data that financial markets are providing and they're drawing conclusions. And those things work until they don't work. And that's the problem. Now, of course, it's maybe valuable to dissect that information and at least understand that. So let's say, for example, if I take the break-even inflation expectation, which is derived from market prices, in particular from the spread between tips and nominal treasuries, that you can say, look, there's really not a lot of information here because it's all just market prices, and they're going to incorporate all the necessary information. But what really makes money, what really is important, is the stuff that is not in there. So the alpha, if you want. And financial economists completely neglect alpha. They're just beta constrained. And that's fine. You can say, look, there's still value in also understanding beta. There's value in doing research about all the dynamics that the available asset prices give us. If you want to use the efficient market hypothesis, you can even argue that far. You can say, look, yes, markets are efficient, incorporate all the data, and it's still worth understanding what dynamics ensue from there, even though we in the financial markets, the real investors, we're interested in alpha. If you want, you can also go even further. You can say, look, there's alpha and beta investors. The alpha people look for alpha, the betas look for beta. The betas are sort of the exploiting what's in the market. That's the algo traders, financial economics. All of these things are beta. And alpha is different. Alpha is trying to understand, okay, if we have, how is AI going to change the dynamics? That's what financial economists call a shock. And the shocks are basically dummy variables for things we couldn't anticipate beforehand. And that's my conclusion here. So the things we couldn't anticipate beforehand, those are the things that make money. Financial economists and most of Wall Street, they spend their time trying to understand what's in the market, what's priced in the market and the dynamics. There's some money to be made maybe, but on aggregate, definitely not. And we at Orange Capital Partners, we are certainly in the alpha game. Now, again, one of the most important conversations I had was with Kent Judd. And he told me about, which is very interesting, he said that the US was going towards high debt to GDP and was losing out on the war with Japan. They had to do a massive invasion, which would have driven the debt to GDP much, much higher. And therefore, we dropped the bomb to stop that, which is the first time I've heard that argument, which is probably coming from the Oppenheimer movie, and he saw that, and he thought about that and all that. I don't know, I hadn't asked him, but I just find it interesting that, we see the world the way we think, and we think the way we see. Thank you.